The Studi is a beauty that is different by design. Up front, you'll
All right, today we are going to talk about Studebaker's President. And if you came expecting to hear something about Sherwood Egbert, Harold Churchill, or Albert Erskine, I'm sorry, not those Studebaker presidents. We were actually talking about the automobiles today. Luxury, style, and power, Studebaker's President. Some of you, do we have any president owners in the audience? Studebaker President, there's one back there. Anyone else? A couple more here. Great. I also own a Studebaker President. It might appear in this program. Just a little foreshadowing there for you. But to talk about Studebaker's President line, we have to go back a little bit before that. Studebaker in the 1920s was doing pretty good. They were showing a profit every year. Their model line was pretty much solidly in the mid-priced market field between $1,000 and $2,000. But Studebaker was also in a period of transition during this time. They were closing down their Detroit plants, shifting production to South Bend. For much of immediately after World War II up until the mid-20s, the South Bend plant was in a furious rebuilding program as Studebaker was opening brand new automobile facilities, as the plant had essentially been a horse-drawn manufacturing facility since its inception up until the discontinuing of wagon production in 1920. So there was a lot going on. This was all under the watchful eye of Albert Erskine and the Studebaker Board of Directors, as they saw a prime opportunity for Studebaker to really assert itself in the automobile market. Now you have to understand during this period as well, it's really starting to shake itself out, the automotive market, from the early 1900s as you see these upstart manufacturers start to disappear as they realize that the economies of scale are such that they just can't compete against the bigger manufacturers of the time. Of course, Henry Ford dominated the low-priced market with the Model T. You had Chevrolet also nipping at the heels of Ford, and Chrysler Corporation, which just came online in 1924, and they were growing rapidly and really taking over kind of that third slot in what would become the big three. And in the other rest of the mix, you had your smaller independent manufacturers like Studebaker, like Hudson and Nash, and other names which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, trying to figure out where they fell in that market share. And to Studebaker's part, they realized a couple things. They had, what the heck did I do, Maria? There we go. That was me, that was not you. There we go. Studebaker at the bottom of their line, they had the Light 6, as you might expect. Next up was the Special 6, and on top of the line, you had the Big 6. Now, if I had you guess where those fell in their market slots, you probably could have figured. The Light 6 was Studebaker's low-price car, but it was not an industry low-price car. The Light 6 retailed for around $1,000 or so. The Special 6 fell in the middle. It's been written that Studebaker during the early 20s had one of the narrowest market shares as far as price blanketing of anyone in the industry, and certainly they were cognizant of that. And the company was looking to really expand its market share for obvious reasons. Also, the names, let's be honest, leave a little to be desired from a creativity standpoint. The Big 6 was, as its name implied, it was a six-cylinder automobile, and it was big. It was a very rugged and reliable car, but modern it was not. The Big 6 engine, its roots lay in the teens. Really, its modern version came out in 1918. And it could take a tremendous amount of punishment, would go on forever and ever. It also drank a lot of fuel and was not a terribly efficient engine. And Studebaker was looking to see what the next generation of its power plants would look like. Another change occurred at Studebaker in the mid-1920s. Studebaker's chief engineer, Guy Henry, left the company and was replaced by a man by the name of Barney Roos. And Barney Roos is one of those names in the auto industry. He had his fingerprints all over the place. His later work at Willis. He had previously done work for Marmon, but in 1926 he was appointed chief engineer of Studebaker as Studebaker began their massive overhaul. There was a new automobile that came online in mid-1926. Studebaker was hoping to really crack the low-price market, and that was the Erskine, named after Studebaker President Albert Erskine. On the other end of the line, a submodel of the Big 6 was renamed the President, and this was the first Studebaker President. It was on a special long wheelbase, 7-passenger model of the Big 6 sedan. As you can see, this was the top end of the line, $2,200 in 1926 dollars. And by comparison, you could buy a Model T for about $300 or $400 at that time. So Studebaker was really spreading their market reach. Now, as far as a automobile, what was new about the President, the first 27 President, the Model ES? Not too much. It was basically a big six that had a fancy name on it, some special interior appointments, lots of standard equipment. But again, this was Studebaker's really first way of dipping their toe in the pool of the luxury market. This is an advertisement we have in our collection. You can see this appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, July 23rd, 1927, and also the American Magazine in August of 1927. Now, as we go forward here, while it is our tendency to talk of automobiles in model years, that's tricky at this point in Studebaker's history, because Studebaker announced in the mid-20s that they were no longer going to adhere to the model year concept and simply refer to models by, as new models needed to be introduced or updated, they would do so. Now, many Studebaker historians have gone back to try and retroactively apply model years to where the breaks come along. But from 1926-27 up until the early 30s, this can be pretty treacherous. So we're going to speak arbitrarily more of calendar dates and how Studebaker referred to these models internally. So the big six, as we mentioned, the President model was introduced in 1926. Was fairly successful, but Studebaker had another ace up its sleeve, and that ace was its all-new inline 8-cylinder engine that came out in the first part of 1928 as part of the Studebaker's Model FA President. Eight-cylinder engines were the sign of luxury, and indeed many of the top marks. This was the ultimate power plant you could get. Barney Roos was hard at work designing a new engine for Studebaker. In its initial form, it displaced 313 cubic inches and put out an even 100 horsepower. Now, 100 horsepower may not sound like much right now, but consider your Model T Ford. You're talking like 30, 40 horsepower at the most for the cars in the lower price market. So this was a significant advancement in the power field. The big six engine that it replaced in its top form, it developed 85 horsepower, but it took 353 cubic inches to do that. The new Studebaker Inline 8 was, by comparison, much more efficient. It was a modern engine, and it was found in, of course, the Studebaker Model FA President line, as we see right here. The FA models were in production from January of 1928 until middle of the year. In July, they introduced a downsized model called the Model FB. At that same time, the President engine was up from its 313 cubic inch displacement to 337 cubic inches. This bought 9 more horsepower, and that was a standard engine for these first series of Presidents. Now, the difference between the FA model, again, that was the first one introduced in the early part of the year, had a 131-inch wheelbase. The Model FB had the 121-inch wheelbase. And the easiest way is to see the difference between the cars right here. We see the 5-passenger sedan. Notice the shorter rear window, and that would be the FB model. And here we see the longer wheelbase for the 7-passenger sedan with the longer rear window. Now, these models stayed in production for the better part of a calendar year, and they were a tremendous success. For the FA and FB models combined, they had a production run of about 12 months. They sold about 26,000 of these cars. That was good for about 25% of Studebaker's total production, and actually outsold the entry-level Erskine that was introduced around this for that contemporary time period. Studebaker had success on their hands, and a big part of it was their successful new President. At its heart, they say, a well-mannered car, great power under perfect control. So you can see we have a display engine up in our President exhibit, very similar to this model right here. From its inception, the Studebaker's Inline 8 had full pressure lubrication in its initial configuration as well, had 5 main bearings, and a very modern, up-to-date power plant. When looking at what some of the contemporaries were still offering, splash lubrication, and were not really engines designed to run at high speeds for a very long time. When you start getting into the next generation of Studebaker Presidents, those would be the model FE and FH cars. And like the FA and FB models, these were updated. The FE, FH cars, again, was produced on two separate wheelbases, 125 and 135 inches. And there were another host of improvements that came along as well. We won't detail, I'm not sure how many people are interested in hearing about ball bearing spring shackles. If you are, we could talk at length at those afterwards. But Studebaker was also, within the run of these models, and this is where this gets confusing, they had several redesigns. Like, as they said, no model year designation, so they would just introduce changes as they went along. So the FE/FH models had a redesign at one point that roughly coincided with the 1930 model year, and it can be very challenging to identify these early Studebaker Presidents, and we do the best we can. Someone actually published this nifty little spotter's guide in a 1973 issue of Turning Wheels, and I was studying that extensively before I came on stage, hoping that I could say, well, this is clearly this one, and this is clearly this one. But trying to determine what was the difference between a long radius fender with a high bead versus a flat radius fender with a modified high bead, I simply gave up and say, these are definitely Studebaker Presidents right here. You can trust me on that. Well, so impressive were Studebaker's new presidents that Studebaker was selected to pace the Indianapolis 500 in May of 1929. We can see this is a special pace car outfitted right here. And in fact, Studebaker even sent down a full contingent of automobiles to help serve as official cars for that race. Not to be outdone, this invitation was not without merit, as Studebaker, a short time before that, had actually dispatched I believe it was 4 presidents to the Atlantic City Speedway near Amatol, New Jersey, as part of an engineering test. Some of you, in one of our previous talks, may recall me talking about Studebaker's 1928 Commander that completed 25,000 miles in less than 23,000 minutes. This was an average of just over 65 miles an hour for about 16 days straight. Well, Studebaker's new 8-cylinder model was bound and determined to outdo what the previous Commander had done, and indeed they did. The new president with its straight 8 engine, 30,000 miles in less than 26,000 minutes. So they not only outstripped the record, they kept going another few days for an even higher average at the time. So Studebaker clearly had a winner on their hand. We see here, this is a later model, I believe. It's hard to tell from this angle. I believe that is the longer wheelbase in that particular body style. As far as styling goes, very handsome cars, but still, we're not quite to the streamlining phase. We'll see that more in a little bit here. But again, these were tremendously successful sales-wise as well. The FE/FH models sold about the same as the earlier FA/FBs, about 26,000. And when you consider this bracketed, the stock market crash too, people were obviously pretty sure that prosperity was just around the corner and didn't really slow their buying of Studebaker Presidents. This would not last. We see here, this is the tried and true big Studebaker President 8. You see an inline 8-cylinder. You don't see that engine configuration anymore. Any 8-cylinder you see is generally a V8 model. Side valve construction, an L head, actually much like your Briggs & Stratton lawnmower, if you had 8 of those single cylinders lined up one next to another and attached. Studebaker this is the water jacket cover on the side, and I look down at Larry and Rick down here in the first row. We were intimately acquainted with water jacket covers on another car in the museum just a few weeks ago. Self-starter right here. This actually has the water pump going off the side of the engine, and the coolant enters up through the water jacket. Today, the water pump would be on the front, but that is the basis for Studebaker's big presidents of 1928 to 1933. They were not shy in promoting the world champion Studebaker, the President 8, and we see this literature for 1931. There were some changes made for the 1931 model year. The Studebaker President 8 was given 9 main bearings instead of the previous 5. Now, this may not mean too much if you're not that familiar with what main bearings do, but the main bearings are there to hold the crankshaft in the engine, and the more of them is generally considered better. And there was a good reason for this as well, which we will get to in just a minute. Unfortunately, the early 30s, when Studebaker was building really the grandest cars that they ever made, the Depression was really taking its hold, and sales were falling year after year. As you can imagine, those who could afford to buy an automobile were generally looking to buy a more inexpensive automobile. Studebaker's Dictator and Commander lines, which were also powered by a smaller 8-cylinder engine, sales fell as well, but not nearly as dramatic as the big Presidents, which again retailed in the close to $2,000 at the time. We see a 1931 President Roadster right here, President Four-Season Roadster is its proper name. And behind it is one of Studebaker's grandest promotions that they ever created. Now I know some of you came in today hoping that we would talk about the big Studebaker Roadster that sat out by the Proving Ground. To promote the new model, Studebaker's experimental body shop built a 40-foot long replica of a 1931 President Four-Season Roadster. This is not a children's car. This is a full-sized 1931 President. The big replica sat just on a prominent bluff about 100 yards west of the main gate of the Proving Ground. Body was made out of wood, but everything else, Firestone made these special rubber tires for it, and it served to promote Studebaker's new products to all passers-by. So we see here it was a prominent spot for VIPs to come to the factory and get their picture taken on the big Roadster. And you may wonder, whatever happened to the big Roadster out at the Proving Ground? Well, unfortunately, by 1936, it always brings a groan every time we show this picture. The Roadster was getting a little long in the tooth. It was sat outside for many South Bend winters and did not look anything like Studebaker's new models, and they decided the best option to get rid of it, since it was made of wood, was to actually apply the torch. And one morning, gasoline was doused on the front fenders, the torch was applied, and they said in about an hour later it was reduced to ashes. You will notice, however, that the hubcaps are missing. The hubcaps were removed and saved for posterity, and at the museum here we are very lucky to have 2 of those in our collection. We have one on display in the in the main level gallery, and we have the other in storage, which we bring out for special occasions. But back to the actual production Studebaker Presidents. Moving forward to 1932, Studebaker had grand things on their mind. Power went up once again from 109 horsepower in the FEFH models of 1929 and 1930. It went to 115 horsepower in 1931. For 1932, the President 8 was pumping out 122 horsepower. And this is actually probably my favorite model year in Studebaker's many model years. Just the cars are just so classic and graceful. Even the literature is just a piece of art. I actually have one of these prints actually framed and hanging in my living room. And that is in agreement with my wife. That's not, I get to hang this and she gets to hang something else. I do love the George O'Keeffe in the corner. It does look quite nice, but the President still holds its own right away. In 1932, Studebaker again was hoping for great things. The Erskine had proven not to be the sales success it hoped it would be. Studebaker introduced a brand new model called the Rockany at the bottom of Studebaker's line. At the top end, Studebaker still had the President. If you wanted an even more expensive model produced by the Studebaker corporate structure, you could go out and buy a Pierce Arrow, as Pierce Arrow was owned by Studebaker during this period as well. I mentioned 122 horsepower from the President 8-cylinder engine. By comparison, you could buy a 1932 Cadillac for $2,800. That had 115 horsepower. A 1932 Lincoln Model KA, 125 horsepower for over $3,000. And Packard's most affordable offering, which was actually very close to the President, that was the Packard Light 8. You could get those for about $1,900, and that had just 110 horsepower. And the President checked in, as I mentioned, roughly comparable with the Packards, but you really got a solid amount of car for your money. It had the Startix automatic starting system. It had many technical advances. Studebaker was out in front in engineering and really producing a solid car for the money. Sadly, few people had money to go down and purchase one. So we see here they even introduced a brand new body style in 1933, the St. Regis Brougham. This was a body style shared with Pierce Arrow, but really a Studebaker exclusive here. The St. Regis Brougham, this is one from our collection. It features an extra long front door. The door seems to go on for miles. And the virtue of this body style was it was said rear seat passengers could enter and exit the vehicle without disturbing the front seat passengers. And actually, it is true, although it helps if you're Maria's size here. For myself or Patrick, we might struggle a little bit getting in and out without disturbing the front seat passengers, but truly, it's one of the most striking and beautiful Studebaker automobiles ever built. Now we get to talk about the bad news. Remember how I said that the FAFB presidents, say 26,000 cars over the span of about a 12-month model run, the FVFH models, about the same but over 18 months. Well, 1932 Studebaker President, the total production of all body styles was 2,399. Not a good year to be producing a luxury automobile. Still, Studebaker was not going to rest on their laurels and just sit around shrugging their shoulders and say, what are we going to do? They tried more ways to promote the superiority of Studebaker products, and that one of these ways was to go racing. Studebaker's racing program at the Indianapolis 500 began in 1930 when a group of individuals decided to see if the President 8 engine would adapt itself to Indianapolis 500 racing. And indeed, there was a rule change at the 500 just the year before that made it possible for production engines to actually compete in the 500. And this opened the door for a whole wave of more affordable racers compared to the specialized units that were racing on the speedway in the 1920s. These group of engineers looked at the Studebaker 8-cylinder engine and thought, boy, this could really work out well at the 500. So they produced a car called the Romthey Special that was named the first initials of each engineer's last name. In 1931, a couple other privateers came around and decided to also take a try with the Studebaker engine, and satisfied that they were, Studebaker fielded a factory team for 1932 and 1933 using the President Straight 8 as its basis. And these cars were built in Studebaker's engineering department. This is actually taken in the engineering building. The chassis were supplied by Herman Riegling of Indianapolis. The coachwork, very similar to other racers too. I believe that was also supplied by Riegling. But the basis, the mechanics, Studebaker engine. The axle was out of, I believe it was a 29 Commander. The brakes were taken from the Studebaker 6, and Studebaker went racing. We see here the 5 Studebaker specials at Indianapolis in 1932. Now, someone told me once that Studebaker still holds the record for having the largest factory-backed effort at the 500. And I need to verify that, so I'm going to qualify that statement, but if someone else out there is more familiar with Indianapolis racing than I am, please let me know if that is fact or just something that sounds good saying it from the podium. The Studebaker team was very successful. The best finish was 3rd at the 1932 race. They returned for 1933, and 7 of the 12 finishers were the Studebakers. Everyone finished. The Studebaker folks finished in the money, but they viewed it as they are not out there to win. They were just out there to make it an endurance test, to demonstrate how rugged and durable the Studebaker President engine was. And indeed, when I mentioned going to the 9-main bearing crankshaft in 1931, it's suspected that that was actually done after the results of the 30 race. To help in the production cars make a more sturdy engine and solider base for racing. Yeah, the 500 has changed a little bit over the years, wouldn't you say? Come on. There. And here we see the cars. 4 of the 5 were rebodied for the 1933 race. Aerodynamics, you wouldn't think that that was that much in play back in the 30s, but yes, they were trying to increase the speed as any way they can. And it reflected well in the qualifying speeds for the cars. Generally, each car with the new body was about 3 to 5 miles an hour faster than its equivalent 1932 cars. And they even did some chassis adjustments too. The engines were moved around in the chassis to get better weight distribution. And of these cars, the Hunt Special is out in Utah. The 34 car is out, that's in private hands in Kansas City. That actually is still raced in vintage events. And the other cars are back with their original 1932 bodies and are in private hands. There's another car down at the Speedway Museum as well. So going forward to 1933, again, Studebaker is holding true to their Their model lineup, you can stair-step you from the affordable Rockney up until the most expensive President. We see here another St. Regis Brougham. The gentleman, I guess, just happens to be carrying skis with him in case he runs into a young lady in the 1933 President. Who's to say? That's not what's happening there. But unfortunately, 1933 was Studebaker's worst model year on record, not counting the post-shutdown years in 1965 and 1966. If you look at Studebaker production, including the Rockney, which although technically a separate brand, was still part of the Studebaker Corporation, just 27,000 cars were produced for the 1933 model year. Again, I go back to 1928, 26,000 Presidents were made just by itself. In 1933, you're looking at just 27,000 cars. Of those, about 1,800 were Presidents. Now, you're thinking, well, gee, Andy, 2,300 Presidents in 1932, 1,800 Presidents in 1933. That doesn't sound too bad. Well, there's more to that tale, as we see here. Notice the 1933 sales literature here. There's suddenly 2 Presidents for 1933. The Speedway President, which includes a host of standard features, everywhere from $1,600 to the Roadster up to $2,040 for the limousine. Then you have the President 8. Again, price points commensurate with the junior model, $1,300 or so for the Roadster, and up to $1,650 for the convertible sedan. And we see a little difference here: 132 horsepower, 110 horsepower. What's going on here? Well, Studebaker did the age-old trick in the industry is they shuffled their model names around, so you walked in the Studebaker showroom thinking you were getting a nicer model than you really were. Let's look at this. 1932. You have the President, the Model 91. That is the big 337 cubic inch straight 8 on a 105 inch wheelbase. For 1933, this is the Speedway President. The 1932 Commander, Model 71, that's the 258 on 101 horsepower on a 125 inch wheelbase. Well, that's now the President, just the regular President for 1933. Then you have the Dictator. Well, the Dictator in 32 now becomes the Commander for 1933. And where's the Dictator in 1933? There is no Dictator in 1933. So the Dictator name got shuffled off, and everyone else just moved one seat down at the table. And unfortunately, the end result did not help sales any. Just looking apples to apples, Speedway Presidents for 1933, 635 were built of all body styles. That's it. Things were looking grim at Studebaker. Things were so grim, in fact, that the company entered receivership in March of 1933. Studebaker simply did not have the funds to go on. They entered receivership, a friendly receivership, but still the company was on the very brink of survival. Studebaker would resume production, obviously, or we're ending the program right here for now, but we got plenty of time left here, so we're going to keep going. Studebaker emerged from receivership in 1934, but with a vastly different lineup. So we see here, the newspapers were full of all the activities regarding the court proceedings. Studebaker executives Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance were appointed receivers, as was Ashton Bean of the White Motor Corporation, as Studebaker held a large amount of White motor stock at the time. They managed to convince the judge that the best way for Studebaker to satisfy its creditors was to resume production, and indeed that's exactly what happened. And they were able to sell Pierce Arrow for $700,000, was enough money they needed to restyle the 1934 models. From the Speedway comes its stamina, from the Skyway comes its style. You see here a 1934 Studebaker President, something new, the Studebakers of 1934. Now notice the Speedway. Studebaker was really going to milk that Indianapolis 500 racing team for all it's worth. They would continue using that slogan, actually, and the icon up into the 1940s, even though they were no longer racing after 1933. And again, it was a testament to Studebaker executives that there was a 34 Studebaker at all. And again, Studebaker came back. They even introduced an all-new body style, the swooping Land Cruiser, which was available in all 3 lines, the Dictator, Commander, and President, and really one of Studebaker's first forays into streamlining. And the Land Cruisers, although not built in great numbers, this was the most expensive Studebakers you could buy in 1934, but tremendously sought after today and increasingly, and just tremendously beautiful automobiles. We wish we had one here at the museum. If you have a Land Cruiser and are looking to maybe pass it on to someone, please keep our phone numbers handy. So what happened in 1934 from a model standpoint? Well, the Speedway President and its big 8-cylinder engine was gone. There was no equivalent for 1934. The previous President, which was actually the 1932 Commander from a slotting standpoint, that became the President for 1934 with the 258 cubic inch 8-cylinder engine. The Commander from 1933, that occupied the same slot, kind of the junior grade President. And the Studebaker 6, that name went away, and the Dictator name came back for 1934 as Studebaker's entry-level model. So conceptually, you still have 3 separate chassis being produced. You have 3 separate models in Studebaker showrooms, but going from the President as being its own exclusive luxury model, now for 1934, the President is essentially a long wheelbase Commander. The engines, the 221 and the 250, are exactly the same externally. The only difference is the stroke is shorter in the smaller engine. Not much. It wasn't the vast distinction you had a couple years earlier. So Studebaker is really trying to sell you on, you got a little nicer car for a little more power. The price differential between the two was a couple $100. From a sales standpoint, sales did rebound for 1934 for the President. They sold about 3,500 of them. Again, not a great total going back to the first year's Presidents, but hey, after, to include both series of Presidents, you've almost doubled your sales from 1933 to 1934. So we'll take a victory anywhere we can get it. For 1935, Studebaker really tried to reassert the President as its luxury model, even though it didn't have the power and prestige that the previous big Presidents had. Studebaker was trying to really make the model stand out. And in 1935, you had a couple, I don't know if you can see it out there. The President had its own special hubcaps that said the President. It had its own special hood ornament. The President had special trim and other options. The interior was this beautiful satin black finish for all the for the instrument panel and the other interior surfaces. You got some extra luxurious interior appointments as well as far as materials and patterns. And Studebaker felt sufficiently proud of this to offer a price premium as well. You had to pay, I believe it was another $300 for the President above the Commander in 1935. Come on. Other new advances for 1935. Overdrive made its debut in 1935 on the President model. It was standard on the President. All Studebakers for 1935 received hydraulic brakes. Independent front suspension was now standard on all Studebaker models except for the Dictator. You got a lot of value-added features for your money in 1935. And they even produced a special President-only sales literature to extol all the virtues of everything the President had to offer. 1935, Studebaker also emerged from receivership. They had this grand parade in downtown South Bend, and if you don't recognize the intersection, this is the Sherlin building right here. This would be Washington Street here and Michigan Avenue. Actually, I had lunch in the Sherlin building today here, and we see this whole parade of Studebaker Roadsters. So how do you tell the President Roadsters from the other? You have to get out a magnifying glass and look at all the hood ornaments to see if you can pick out the President hood ornaments. We're not going to do that right now. We'll save that for a later activity. Unfortunately, the 1935 Presidents didn't sell, hardly at all. Only 2,300 were built, and here's a big reason why. Packard introduced its 120 model in 1935. This was Packard's mass-produced car. They actually brought in people from General Motors to show Packard how to mass-produce an automobile. And Packard, being the preeminent luxury name for many, many years, to suddenly crash the medium-price field, well, who do you think that left standing out to dry? Studebaker and everyone else trying to produce kind of their upper-model luxury cars. You could buy a 1935 Packard 120, again, same horsepower as the President, roughly the same size as the President, for about $300 less than Studebaker President. Now, I love my Studebakers, but if I'm talking about I can buy a Packard for less than the Studebaker and I get the Packard quality and the name behind it, that's really going to be a problem. And they sold close to 30,000 120s in 1935. Studebaker was, they weren't just sitting there scratching their heads. They decided to kind of reposition their model lineup as well. So for 1936, instead of offering two 8-cylinder models, they scaled back to one, just the President. And the Dictator continued as an entry-level 6-cylinder model. What Studebaker essentially did was take the Commander line offering and at the Commander price point, put it on the President chassis, and that was the new President. So Studebaker, in response to Packard, priced it more competitively. And it was a success. I mean, sales rebound. In 1936, sales almost tripled compared to 1935 for the President. And even going ahead to 1937, sales continued to rise as Studebaker was really on a roll. And the cars, it wasn't just the name and the engine. Studebaker was offering some pretty significant features of these models. You had an all-steel roof in 1936, one of the first in the industry. They advertised it as the largest single steel stamping in the industry. No more fabric inserts in your roof. If anyone is familiar with how the Cord 810s and 812s were put together, those roofs were put together from 7 or 8 different pieces, different stampings that had to be welded and leaded in. Not so with Studebaker. The whole roof was one section. I think this is actually why they have a show, The Ladies Dancing on the Roof, to show how strong the Studebaker roof is. If anyone owns a 37 Studebaker, you should try this just to make sure that your roof is up to muster. And Studebaker, too, even tried to gussy up the Presidents a little bit in 1937. You'll see there's the model called the State President. For an extra, I believe it was $45. You got some extra trim. You got some special interior appointments. These fancy schmancy hubcaps, or if you ever see those at a swap meet, snap them up because they are like hen's teeth. But still, the President for 1937, 9,100 examples. That was actually its best showing since the early 1930s. In 1938, Raymond Loewy styling came on board as Raymond Loewy Associates, who was hired by Studebaker in 1936. The first design off their drawing boards were the 38 models, and they dressed up the 1939s, kind of taking a page from the Lincoln Continental School with the waterfall grills. But we notice here at the 39, notice they're still advertising the speed of the Indianapolis 500 race, saying, don't forget, we were there and we did pretty well, and you get that same value in engineering in your new Studebaker products. Another new Studebaker product hit the line in 1939, and that was the Studebaker Champion. After some repeated efforts to crack the low-price field, Studebaker finally did, and the Champion debuted in May of 1939, and it was a hit. Champion was in production for about half a year, so 4 or 5 months. They sold close to 30,000 Champions in that span. That was almost as many cars as they sold in 1938 all by themselves. In fact, the Champion was so successful that Studebaker for the next couple of years found themselves where the Champion was probably taking food out of the Commander and President's mouths as well, because you see President sales were continuing to stay pretty high for 1939, but then in 1940, both Commander and President sales fell off while this Champion volume was skyrocketing. And this wasn't a case of industry volume was dropping. If you look at it too, from 1939 up through 1941, those 3 model years, the industry's output was going pretty steady, about a million and change more cars were being sold each year. So clearly, it wasn't the demand for cars that was the problem. It's just Studebaker was probably not figuring out the best way to market their Commander and President models at the expense of the Champion. We see here a 1940 President. You can see this one upstairs in our President's exhibit as well. Just a word on this car. This is one of the few you will see with dual side-mounted tires. Side mounts were kind of on their way out in the late 1930s, and actually 1940 was the last year you could get a Studebaker with side-mounted spares. And this is exhibited through the courtesy of Museum Life trustee Richard Quinn. As we move on to 1941, Studebaker is finally starting to get a handle on what proper way to position their models. And it's been said no one produced a bad-looking car in 1941. I might be a little biased to that. That's my President on the right there. But Studebaker was really starting to, the volume of their model offerings in different trim levels, you need an abacus and a flow chart and probably Bill Gates to help you keep track of them all. The first series of 1941 models here, they call those the deluxe tone. You see the stripe that goes from front to rear. That's how you identify those. And below that was the custom model, which still had the stripe, but it did not have the contrasting two-tone trim. And see if you can spot the error here. Notice it says Studebaker President up here. If you read the script on the artwork, it says Commander. Oops, someone let that slip through past the copywriters. In the spring of 1941, Studebaker, again, kicked the President and Commander models further up the market line. You had now the Skyway series. This was Studebaker's top trim level. It was devoid of the stripe, but you got a standard radio, you got standard overdrive, hill holder, heater, everything, some very nice wool broadcloth interior with leather accents on there. And the Skyways were very successful, and a fair number of them do survive to this very day. And the President responded. They bounced back. Actually, sales were up about 10% over 1940. And I'm sure it was the hope that Studebaker buyers would come in and say, you know, they'd see myself coming in and say, that guy wants a champion, and then hope I come back in a few years after I saved up enough money to trade off on a Commander, and then ultimately to a President. Unfortunately, World War II prevented us ever knowing if that would happen. So we mentioned Raymond Loewy earlier. Loewy's designs are a success for Studebaker, and it's pretty clear that they know they got a good thing going, because you start to see Loewy's name as a celebrity stylist. And notice they promote him by Raymond Loewy, America's foremost industrial designer. 1942, the model year got off in fall of 1941. War clouds were on the horizon, and when Pearl Harbor took place in December of 1941, it's pretty clear that things were going to change in this country pretty quickly. All automotive production was shut down at the end of January 1942. And in fact, the last Studebaker civilian automobile built was a President. This is a 1942 President, the last car come off the assembly line before military production began. And that's really an end of a chapter too, because once peacetime resumed and Studebaker looked at their post-war market, the President was not among their offerings for 1946, 1947. However, that's not to say they didn't think about it, because we have some pictures here that show some proposals, and these have been worked on during the wartime, but Studebaker was considering bringing back the President after World War II. And unfortunately, they just decided ultimately not to. To occupy the President's slot, they offered the Commander Land Cruiser, which was a long wheelbase four-door sedan. That was Studebaker's most luxurious offering, their most expensive offering. And to look at the sales figures, it's hard to argue with their decision. They sold Land Cruisers hand over fist without having to retool up to build the President's engine and the associated. It was basically just a long wheelbase Commander. So many things could be shared from one across the model year. Certainly from the economics, it made sense. From the production side, from a marketing side, though, you would have to say, Studebaker, you make more money on your more expensive automobiles. Plus, there's the extra prestige factor there as well. Had Studebaker bought back the President, would they have been able to kind of hang on the fringe of the upper middle price class? Maybe, we don't know. But certainly it's something, it's great to talk about that in the parking lot discussions at Studebaker Drivers Club meets. What if they brought back the President and many other topics that come up? There's usually beer involved, just saying. Well, the President did make a comeback. In the mid-1950s, as America's horsepower race was gearing up, Studebaker, unfortunately, was having a little bit of a tough time, but they saw there was maybe a way to bring back a newer model and to put some spice into their marketing, into their model lineup. So in 1955, the President name was dusted off and offered in a full range of body styles. You see the President Starliner hardtop, the President sedan right here. Kind of similar in formula to the early 40s Studebaker models. The President offered a little nicer interior, like in the 55s, the President instrument panels were gold-plated with like a gold wash on them compared to the chrome-plated units on the Commander models. Again, a little nicer interiors. Initially, they offered a little more power. The President got the 259 engine instead of the Commander's 224. And they even had another trick up their sleeve. How do you really go upscale? Well, the President's Speedster. That was the ultimate 1955 Studebaker. A limited run, they only produced 2,215 of those. But for those who demand the best, Rick Strand, I'm looking at you. This is, Rick walks into a Studebaker dealer, they're going to say, sir, step over here and see the Speedster. This is clearly the car for you. A full range of very wild colors you could have. You saw the tritone on the previous picture there. They call this the lemon lime, Hialeah green, and Sun Valley yellow. Controversial. People who, and if anyone is very fond of this color, I just have to tell this because this joke was shared with me. Someone told me if you ever changed a diaper, you could never own that car. Just saying. New parent in the room, Pat Slavonic looking at you. I personally like it myself. The Speedster, complete with its rich leather interior that we see here in Congo ivory and the lipstick red carpeting. It had a special instrument panel of engine-turned stainless steel. I mean, this was the bee's knees in 1955. Studebaker felt that the president was doing good enough. They brought it back for 1956. So we see here the president, again, stood at the top of Studebaker's lineup in 1956. It actually, the first appearance of Studebaker's 289 cubic inch V8, that was the president's power plant. And you get the president in the 2- and 4-door models here. You had the long wheelbase President Classic, the regular 4-door sedan, the shorter wheelbase you could also get in the president model. Dealers nicknamed that the vice president. I swear to God, I'm not making that up. And you could even get the president in a station wagon as well. So we move ahead to 1957. You see, the president in these years, I talked about how in 1934 the president was really a long wheelbase commander. Sheet metal wise, there was no difference between the commander president and champion lines in 1955 through 1958. It's just a matter of interior trimmings, paint scheme, and engine choice. But see here, the 56 presidents, someone told me that how you tell, it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 for the color scheme. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. If you've got the 5 different differentiations of color, it's a president. In 57, you got the little scallop here on the rear. That tells you that that's a president. The commanders and champion have their own trim level, have their own unique paint schemes. And moving ahead to 1958, when everything had 4 headlights, and Studebaker was no exception. You can always tell, again, the president's, it has the fin and the contrasting top on the 2-tone models too, and again, that's unique to the 58 presidents. And there's also a new addition for 1958 as well, not just for the president, but across the line, Studebaker now had the sedan-sized hardtop, the president hardtop. They called it the Starlight for that year. The only year that the Starlight name was actually applied to the hardtop body. And just so we are clear, the hardtop, we are not talking about any model that's with a hard top on it. This was meant to mimic a convertible with its top up. So the hardtop has frameless windows, it has no B-pillar. It's a very airy, very open body design. And they only made a handful of these for 1958. You see the gold and white one. Here, and you can get best view. A lot of people think that roof looks like a Chrysler of the same period. It's similar, but they are not the same. Don't go cutting a roof off a Chrysler to try and put it on your 58 president, unless you know the guy with the Chrysler really well. One of the newest additions to the museum's collection is on display as part of the president's exhibit upstairs, a 58 President hardtop, courtesy of our friend Mark James from Lititz, Pennsylvania, in that exact same paint scheme. Absolutely stunning automobile. Be sure and check that out before you go. Well, 1958 is the final year for the president name. Studebaker really put its eggs in the Lark basket. In 1959, they saw the compacts, affordable automobiles was the best pass for them. And indeed, the sales really reflect that. The president's 1955, they sold 24,000 cars against a volume of 133,000. By 1958, it was down to just 10,000 presidents of all body styles. And the Lark by itself sold 130-some thousand cars in 1959. Studebaker decided they just weren't going to compete against the big three. They had to find their own niches in the marketplace. Unfortunately, the president was a casualty of that. But for 20-some seasons, it remained atop Studebaker's lineup and is certainly a fine automobile. and certainly very popular amongst collectors today, and it's many generations.
Studebaker